We're gonna get to our most anticipated part of the night. So I'm gonna introduce to you our guest speaker, and I'll be honest. Kevin came up to me and said, "But this guest speaker wanted a humble introduction, but we really wanted you to really know him before he comes up." So I'm gonna tell you just a little bit about him. So our guest speaker is originally from Igboland in Nigeria. He arrived in Montreal in the summer of 2021, and he's the chaplain at the Newman Center of McGill University. He studied at the University of Leuven in Belgium, where he did his doctoral work in theology and obtained a Doctor of Sacred Theology in 2020. So without further ado, I'd like you to put your hands together for Father Anthony Atansi.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your very kind introduction. Does that give you hope? Thank you, and I'm very privileged. It's for me a joy to be here. Sincerely, I often say to people, why I love my priestly ministry and life. I've got the best job in the world as a priest. It's because it's such a ministry that enriches you. I mean, when people tell me, oh, Father Anthony, you are very busy, I say, I'm not busy, I'm living, I'm alive. Because wherever I go to minister or to serve people, I feel so enriched. And when we were planning this event and had the meeting on Thursday with Kevin and your parish priest, I mean, the program was for me a perfect experience of that context where I always feel enriched. And coming in to see all these lovely faces, new faces, beautiful church, warm people, organized setting, lovely music. I mean, what else can I say of hope? So I'm very grateful to be here to reflect with us on the joy of hope, rejoicing in hope. Perhaps I could begin with a story. In 1993, I was diagnosed of cerebral malaria. Malaria is a very common disease in my own part of the world. But mine was so terrible that it had an effect on my brain. 1993. And it was already mentioned by the doctor that I may not be able to get through the situation. And if at all I get through the situation, I wouldn't be fully myself as a person. I would lose a part of my mental capability because of this disease. 1993. The reports are still there in my room back home because on the day of my ordination, some years after, in 2012, my mom was ceaselessly crying on the day of my ordination, looking at me as that child that the doctor said would not be well again with full mental capability because of this disease. But she had hope. And eventually, I recovered from the illness. And 30 years after that, my mom gave me a call on the 8th of March to say to me that my younger brother has just been admitted in the hospital. And I said, what was wrong? He said he had a bit of an attack, and then they took him to the hospital, but that he'll be fine. He was sitting next to him on his bed, by his side, praying, interceding that he be well. The following morning, my mom called me with a loud cry that my brother has just died. And then she said to me, Father, Amy, Amy, my child. That's what my mom calls me. Amy, my child. Take heart. There is hope. And I'm like, hope? Brother has just died, Mom. And you say to me that there is hope. Exactly the same thing you said 30 years ago when the doctor said I was going to lose a part of my mental ability. That there is hope. I became well. I became a priest. I went to one of the best universities in Europe. Had the greatest distinction in my studies because you said that there was hope and that there is hope. And you are still talking of hope in the face of my brother's demise. It was then that I realized that hope is deeper than optimism. I was ill. I became well. My brother was ill after 30 years of my own experience. He took ill and died. And my mother, standing in between these two experiences, still tells me that there is hope. What's the ground of the hope? What's the meaning of this hope that my mother continues to speak of, even in her pains, even in her grief? She still tells me that there is hope. I refer to my mother because she's my best friend, and I'm her best friend. I'm my mom's favorite. She loves me so much, so her stories stay with me. She always inspires me. How can she be talking of hope in these two situations? Hope. And that brings me to reflect with us on what is hope on this first day. What is this hope that my mother continues to refer to? In the situation that turned out hopeful, I became well. That was a hopeful situation. And still, she mentions hope in a situation that didn't turn out hopeful. It's almost a year that my brother passed on, but my mother still speaks of hope. And then I come to realize that the hope she's talking of here is that God-given gift that takes on our different aspirations, optimisms, expectations, and places them in the heart of God. God's faithfulness was and is still the ground of my mother's hope. God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness. And that's why in speaking of hope, we think of it as one of those theological virtues. And when we speak of theological virtues, God-given gifts, the outpouring of the Spirit in our hearts, by which we hold on, we are able to hold on to the promises of Christ. To rely not on our own strength, but on the help of the grace of the Holy Spirit. That's how I'm able to plumb the meaning of hope, following my mother's own experience of hope, amidst seemingly different situations. If you like, what I often call the contrast experiences of life. Last Sunday, I was reflecting with the people in the parish at Mary Queen of the World and with the students on the homily that I titled Contrast Experiences, the covenant experience and the one in between. Life is about these contrast experiences. I took ill, the doctors gave their report, and I became well. And here am I today, stepping into the 12th year of my priesthood. Something that my mother could not imagine the night I lay on the bed in coma state because of this ill health. And then 30 years after that, my brother took ill and died. That is just life. contrast experiences. And it seems that in the nature of things, in the nature of events, life is about these contrast experiences, the ups and the downs. Last Sunday, we hear of Jesus entering into the wilderness of the world, where he was tormented by the wild beasts, but at the same time ministered to by the angels. But there is an in-between, so that life is not just simply about this dangling between opposites. That in-between is this holding on to the promises of Christ, and that remains the ground of hope for my mom, for Christ himself, whom we hear of in the letter to Titus, that also received this outpouring of hope in God the Father, who in today's gospel speaks of Christ as the beloved Son. It is this faithfulness of God that remained the grounding of Christ's hope amidst his own contrast experiences. Hope. Still speaking of what is this hope. It takes up the hopes that inspire our activities. We believe that things will be fine. We express that things will be well again. Humanity will know peace. There will be joy in the land. My daughter will be well again. Things will become fine. These are all our aspirations. But that is not the hope that we are speaking of tonight. The hope we are speaking of tonight as that theological virtue takes up these tiny hopes of ours and purifies them so as to order them according to the plan of God. So there is, if you like, a capital H, hope, and the small tiny hopes we have that tomorrow will be Monday. That's like the tiny hope. That things will be well again. These are the tiny hopes. But there is the grand hope that sustains the ground hopes. What is more? This hope that is a gift from God, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in our hearts, keeps a person from discouragement. Keeps a person from discouragement. It sustains him or her in and during times of abandonment. And I think that's what my mom was feeling in those dark days following my brother's demise. She was being sustained in those times of abandonment. And it opens the heart in expectation. According to St. Paul in today's letter to the Romans, that all things work unto good for those of them that love and trust in God. It opens our heart. So this hope is the gift that opens our heart to the eternal blessedness of God. And buoyed up by this hope, a person is preserved from selfishness and led to the happiness that God himself realizes in one. But when all is said and done about this action and the experience of hope, the one thing that remains, that hope is that ground of God's presence and his action in our hearts and in every situation. St. Paul in today's letter to the Romans says, what can separate us from the love of God? Nothing. Illness, nakedness, suffering, peril. St. Paul says, in all these things we are more than conquerors, thanks to the one who loves. So it is the love of God that is actually the ground of hope. It is God's love, his faithful love, is the ground of hope. Not our own achievements, because time and again, our own achievements might fail us. Our own strength might fail us. Our own resources might fail us. We all have experiences of these failures and limitations of human abilities. But to know, to come to this knowledge of God's love for humanity is the one thing that sustains us amidst the contrast experiences of life and fills us with the strength to keep navigating and to confront the challenges of life. So the ground of hope is the gift of God's love, that is that constant experience amidst the contrast experiences of life. And then the question becomes, where can we find this hope? Where is this hope in today's world that Pope Francis has described in his Lenten pastoral letter? That is a world marked by deficit of hope. How can we speak of hope when Ukraine is still being bombed? How can we speak of hope when there are many women and children wailing in Gaza and in Israel because their loved ones are no more? How can we speak of hope in a time when there are many people sold to sex and human trafficking? How can we speak of hope? How can I speak of hope when my younger brother passed on and I still live in the darkness of grief and pain? How can we really speak of hope? So where do we find this hope amidst the deficit of hope, to use Pope Francis's phrase? The first and foremost places where we could discern this hope is by turning to God Himself. He is the ground of hope. And He has revealed this strength of hope in this one who has become for us a wounded God. And that's why I often say to people that the cross of Jesus for us, that is the image of the church, the image of hope. On this cross of Christ, we can still find light. Pope Francis speaks of the light that comes from hope. And it is a light we garner by fixing our gaze on Him, who by His own suffering, by His own death, by this symbol of hopelessness, has conquered situations of hopelessness. It's the divine exchange in Him. Christ remains for us the viable point of reference as we wrestle with hope and hopelessness in our world. My dear brothers and sisters, perhaps in our own personal lives, in our own situation, we may be wrestling with experiences that challenge hope, experiences that confront us. Perhaps you may be in that situation where there seems not to be hope. You have lost hope. Yes, it's fine to be there because sometimes life brings you to a place where you feel so helpless. But it is in that helplessness that strength of hope is unleashed. And that's why we have gathered tonight to turn to Him who remains the source of hope for our world. And like my mother, she said to me yesterday, Father Remy, in all that we continue to wrestle with following your brother's demise, in all that my family continues to struggle with, I have come to the deepest realization, she said, that I will never give up on Christ. I will never give up on Him. Because it is to Him alone that I gaze, and I still see some light and strength that fills me with meaning in a seemingly meaningless world and life. Looking on to Christ, we read from the letters to the Hebrews chapter 12, He is the author and the finisher of our life. It is only by gazing unto Him, she said to me, I've seen the worst of it. I've seen the worst of it. But thanks to this man and the Spirit that moves me to keep my eyes on Him, I am able to find hope in a world that has become so meaningless and painful for me. My dear brothers and sisters, on this first day of our reflection on the joy that comes from hope, I'm inviting us to open our hearts to the hope that comes from Christ, to the hope that strengthens us amidst the contrast experiences of hope and of hopelessness. And Christ remains for us that point of reference in a seemingly hopeless times.